thank you for taking the time to talk with me today, and to the students at the University of Waterloo. I think the discussion is going to be very useful for them. And can I just start by asking you to tell me about the work that you do at the University of Oregon?
Sure, yeah. So at the University of Oregon, I just began as an assistant professor this year. I research typical brain development in childhood and adolescence, specifically focusing on networks in our brain that are involved in social cognition, cognitive control, reward processing, and how these different processes integrate with each other to facilitate optimal developmental processes in adolescence. I also am very interested in the effects of the environment, how we develop to navigate our specific social environments. So how we might develop certain cognitive or behavioral strategies that are most optimal for the environment that we have been raised in or are continuing in.
So I understand that to mean that it's about how the things that are around people influence their development, and how you can best guide them to come through that as well as possible.
Yes, I definitely take the perspective of what can we change about our social structures that will be most able to nurture optimal development, rather than thinking about what can we change about an individual. So I take that perspective.
Very interesting. Okay, and one of the things I noticed about your work was that you stress the importance of evidence in scientific understanding. I thought that you give that high level of importance, as good researchers should, but you especially mention it. You're clearly very conscious that that's important, and I was keen to understand why you believed that that was so important today.
Evidence for guiding policy, or just general knowledge?
Yes, both, I guess, but more policy, I guess.
Sure, I think it's so I guess I can take the perspective of things changing in a society rapidly, or rapidly in the sense that maybe new things are introduced into a society before research has had a proper amount of time to investigate the effects of, say, new access to digital technologies, new digital technologies. And I think it's very easy for especially adults to have concerns or observe anecdotally effects that may be having affects these new events or structures or phenomena could have on themselves, on others around them, before there's proper amount of time to investigate these. And so I think we're not going to eliminate, as humans, concerns about understanding how the world affects us or things in the world affect us, but I think it can be easily, these concerns and anecdotal information can build up faster than empirical evidence.
Yes, and that, I think, is what we're going to talk a lot about today, because we do seem to be going through, especially over the last few years, maybe more so, concern about technology, information technology, and the internet. And so I thought I'd just start by asking if you could describe what some of those popular concerns are today, as a way of introducing the areas we're going to cover.
Yeah, just like with previous new technologies, I almost like to start always when talking about technology in general, just to think about what the definition of technology is. It's a new capability or tool, really, that has been developed based off of kind of scientific progress or industry in general. So television, books, writing, these are all examples of technologies that have been that have come about. And digital technologies, and especially regarding using a screen to gather information or interact with other people or play games or watch or engage in or watch entertainment or create content as well. have been an emerging concern, emerging kind of technological concern. And some of the concerns involve that it might be reducing the attention spans of the general public, but more so the developing population, that it might be affecting brain development or rewiring the brain of developing populations, because we know that the brain is undergoing substantial development in childhood and adolescence. It may be the concern is that because so much is changing, that then the brain at this time is more vulnerable to environmental impacts, such as exposure to a new kind of technology. Concerns that it's creating a more socially isolated society in general, and also maybe affecting the social cognitive capabilities of developing populations, again, because of this interacting through digital technology. And then a lot of these concerns actually hinge on the hypothesis that engaging in digital technologies, especially to engage in social communication, displaces time spent in real life, IRL communication. And that displacement hypothesis has not as much evidence as you would think, considering how much is just provided as like a basis for these other concerns.
Yeah, and in your work, you I think highlight the evidence around these things is relatively weak so far. Many areas we don't have much evidence at all, but people have quite firmly held opinions, or some of them have quite firmly held opinions inside these areas.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the first one of the areas you mentioned, and I've got a little list, I guess, that we're going to go through, but one of them was around the influence on brain development. This, I think, is really quite interesting. Susan Greenfield has written a lot in this area. You've commented on her work before, I think. But she basically argues that people's brains are physically or physiologically changed as a result of the internet. And I was keen to know what evidence there might be for this, and whether you think it might be true, or whether it's proven at least.
Sure. So I would like to start off contrasting the idea of what we mean by an effect on our brains. So everything that we do, everything we learn, everything we experience, our brain is responding to, and our brain is plastic to that extent throughout our life. If not, we would be dead. The brain would be pretty dysfunctional. So our experiences throughout our lives, including engaging in digital technology, of course, have an impact on our brain. But this is it's a minimal impact. It's the same as drinking coffee. Well, maybe coffee was probably have a more of an impact, considering the effects of caffeine. But reading a book or talking with other people, everything. That's probably not what she's talking about. But I do like to give that to contrast that with the type of change that is being proposed in terms of rewiring how the brain is organized, and changing the level of reward responsivity, so how the brain might react to rewarding scenarios, or maybe even showing like an addictive property in terms of engaging in certain behaviors that involve being online. And there's really minimal evidence for that, for a couple of reasons. So there have been a few cross-sectional studies investigating how individuals who have already been categorized as being somewhat dysfunctional in their use of the internet or gaming through like online gaming, compared to individuals who are from a community sample or may not be considered having an issue, and seeing differences in their brains. Now that could be used as evidence that yes, the internet is having a major impact on the brain, but really there are two issues with that. One being that this is already a group of individuals who have already been found to be having some sort of issues, and that is definitely not representative of the population, especially of internet users. So that's not transferable to the general population, those findings. And also it's cross-sectional, so we don't really know if it's something about whatever's going on in that individual that might be relating to their pathological use or dysfunctional use of the internet versus if there's something about using the internet that then caused an issue in their brain organization or functionality. Now, there's starting to be a couple of studies that have looked at typically developing individuals or individuals who have not been categorized as having dysfunctional internet use or screen engagement. One recent study came out from the ABCD study here in the States, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. And that was a large sample of 4,500 9 to 10-year-olds. And again, this is a cross-sectional study comparing how engagement with different types of screen media technology, so chatting with using technologies to chat with other people, to receive entertainment, to play games, all of these different types of screen behaviors were measured, albeit with questionnaire, and related to the brain structure. Sorry, I have some students out in the hallway here. I don't know if we can hear.
That's okay.
And then they found a relationship between brain structure and these screen engagement profiles. Now, that can't tell us anything, again, about the direction of this relationship. And there have been some interpretations of these data that I think have gone beyond the evidence, saying that it's an indication that the brain is maturing faster for individuals who use, who are more heavily, who engage with screens more heavily. But because this is cross-sectional, we cannot make that kind of inference until we are able to follow these individuals longitudinally and see how the brain structure changes across time, and if that's different for individuals who are more heavy users versus lighter screen users.
Okay, so you seem to be saying that these things may be happening, but we don't have evidence. There's nothing there to say for sure that this is happening now.
We're still in the cross-sectional stage where we don't have any evidence for causality. We can see associations potentially, and they're just now starting to be studies that are using a typical, representative sample of individuals, but it's still very early days.
Okay, and with that, an area, I guess, that's related to this, is the internet making people more violent? Are, gamers who are using violent games, if that's appropriate to say, I don't know if the games themselves are actually violent, but the violence inside them, does that make people more likely to do violent things?
I'm not as well versed in this literature as maybe others are, so I'll just put that out there.
Okay.
My understanding is, again, that the effect, if any, on engaging in violent video game usage and then relating that to subsequent engagement in maybe more disruptive or antisocial behaviors is small. And also that there have, in contrast to what you might expect, there has been research using what's called like first-person shooter games that has related individuals who play those games or even trained, put into an experimental study where they are assigned to playing these games, related to perceptual motor coordination and actually finer perceptual motor coordination and things that we will probably want to see in an individual rather than I should say those studies aren't necessarily trying to look at the link between violent video game usage and violent behavior, but looking at video game usage and how that relates to cognitive and perceptual processes. So there could be mixed effects there if we're depending on the hypothesis that we go into with this. And those studies actually don't see that same effect if you're playing these more pro-social, non-violent kind of first-person shooter games.
Okay, so you seem to be saying, and tell me, if I misinterpret, but that the effects, if there are effects from what we understand so far, are not big, probably, for most people, and that they could be good as well as bad.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's important to think about what the effect size is for these relationships because, well, I don't know if we want to get into that now or later in the conversation. But
I think now's okay. We've got. I'll just modify a little bit if we need to.
So the effect size is, I think, so important to consider, not just when we talk about the effects of technology use, but I mean, in all of research, really. But it often gets pushed under the rug. It's starting to become more talked about in psych. I mean, psychologists obviously talk about effect sizes, but in the media, it's starting to get starting to be a resurgence of not just looking for there was a significant difference, but what was the actual level of change? Is this something that we need to and warn the public about? Is this something that warrants change in policy? And a lot of the recent studies that have investigated the size of the effect of engagement with digital technologies and mental health outcomes in young people or general functioning in young people have found that these effects are quite small, and really other things in the environment that we could be promoting and thinking about and talking about and could receive more media attention, really, such as having breakfast and making sure you get adequate sleep, have such a larger effect on these outcomes that we care about than engagement in screen media. So even though screen media is gets more attention, it may actually not be the most effective route for policy change.
Okay, and so one person who gets a lot of attention for arguing about the impact of the internet is someone has a name, the same last name as me. We're not related, but Nicholas Carr, who argued that the internet was making people stupid, and I was keen to understand how you saw that, and whether our memories and attention spans are influenced by internet use, and whether this was bad.
Sure. So there seems to be evidence that there is an impact on having what I guess the structure of being in a society where the internet is available on cognitive strategies. So for instance, people are less likely to remember telephone numbers now and this is interesting to say, okay, well, is that actually a bad thing that people are less likely to recall telephone numbers of their loved ones? It would be a bad thing if we had no access to that number. But is it actually something that we should be worried about? Should we be bringing back, the memorization of everything that we need to know in case of an emergency, or finding our way around maybe is a little less. I don't know the evidence behind that. What I'll talk a little bit about is that paper by Betsy Sparrow and colleagues that has received a lot of attention regarding the Google effect, where there seemed to be evidence if individuals expect to have access to information in the future, they're less likely to try to memorize that information, but more likely to understand, to remember how to find that information. So that's a shift in cognitive strategy based off of a change in the broader environment, what kind of what would we call them, external cognitive resources we have at our disposal, like the internet. Mm-hmm. And I think the real question is that might be a change in how people engage in remembering information, but is that a functional change? I think it's much more functional for me to remember how to find information than to remember everything that I have to that I read. I just think I would be more effective at my job that way. But I think it's a thing for us to reflect upon. What is really helping us?
Mm-hmm. And with that, Nicholas Carr argued that these things were leading to people becoming more shallow, and partly because I guess that they were losing these or not remembering things or examining things as deeply. And your argument appears to be that this isn't necessarily bad, that that learning how to find information may well free up other areas of our other space in our brain to be able to gain more knowledge.
Sure. I think I'm not sure there's much empirical evidence supporting the idea that people are in general more shallow in their thinking. I think there's been quite a bit of individual variability for a long time in humans, and I think that distribution of depth of engagement and thinking is probably still pretty similar. That would be my hypothesis.
That makes sense. And so the next question I've got is really around whether teenagers and others, the stuff I've read seems to have been more focused on teenagers, but whether they're becoming more less social and perhaps more lonely than previous generations.
Sure. I think they're not becoming less social in general. I don't know about the loneliness trends. I know there might be some cross-sectional cohort data measuring this, but so I don't know what that is. I couldn't report on that. But the primary activity that's being used through digital technologies is that of social communication with teenagers. And teenagers report that this is actually really helpful for them to maintain social ties, to create more intimacy between their friends. There's been some research even demonstrating that interacting through video chat or through text messaging can still evoke very similar emotions and the social kind of back and forth that we also experience when we're in front of someone in real life. So I think there's been general shifts that are occurring alongside the increase in digital technology use that are getting less attention when we think about how the general trends and how teenagers have been feeling and what they report and how they interact. So, for instance, a greater fear in letting teenagers go out on their own has led to more teenagers being having less agency to explore their environments, and so there's still the drive to connect with other people, especially peers, and that just is being shifted onto online means because perhaps there's a barrier, perhaps they're not given the same type of agency to do that in real life as previous generations. And then also, we're not talking necessarily about mental health now, but I think it's interesting how the increase in digital technology use is not just a bit about the medium, the way in which we interact with each other, but also the amount of information and possibilities and that teenagers are then exposed to through that medium. And a lot of information we're receiving about the world can be very depressing and can be very overwhelming, especially regarding climate change and a lot of larger political structures that teenagers have no agency because they can't vote or because they're left out of many important conversations to change. And I think that is wrapped up also with increases in digital technology use, that receiving of information. And anyway, I think that thinking about larger social structures that might be interacting with increases in digital technology use will be more fruitful when we try to understand shifts in mental health in teenagers across generations.
So you're suggesting that because that the internet gives teenagers access to more information about the world and possibly also to debates and conflicts about the world that will be taking place online, and that this may influence their behavior more than simply their interaction with the nature of the technology itself.
Yeah, that's a hypothesis I have.
Yes.
Empirical support for it yet, but
yeah, well, it's good to discuss areas that would be good to look at and other possibilities as far as the areas that people are concerned about today. So very interesting. The you've also, I think, talked about social evaluation, the way that people are more visible. I read an article this week about something that was called Snapchat dysmorphia. This was in the Guardian, and it was, you know, the idea that people are doing more plastic surgery and Botox and other things, partly because they are concerned to appear. The argument in the article, and I, don't know how seriously it should be taken, but the article was that Snapchat filters and people being able to alter their appearance contributed to people thinking, in real life, I need to look as similar to, whether it's good or not, I don't know, but similar to what I look like online, and so I'm going to go and do these things to my appearance. So, is social evaluation more of an issue today? Are people influenced by this?
I think, I mean, social evaluation is a perennial issue. It's been a I think functional concern for a long time for humans. It's a natural human desire to want to fit in, or at least not be ostracized from our social groups. It's that, I mean, historically, or it's a way in which we could survive, because we rely so much on our social structures for safety and gathering food and so on. And today it's no different. We learn a lot from our peers, especially in the teenage years, when maybe our parents' information about the world is outdated, and we really need to learn about what the world will be like when we are able to be more agentic in it. And so social evaluation serves a functional purpose, but it's interesting to think about it, how the scale in which the scale in which we are socially evaluated, I think, has definitely shifted with the online environment, because whereas maybe social evaluation occurred only when we were in a public context or when we were around our peers, now it can continue on throughout the day, 24 hours a day, really, in our online presence. I'm not sure that I know much about how that might impact the likelihood of someone changing their appearance or getting plastic surgery. I think we could look back to the research about introducing television or different types of media to cultures that had previously been isolated, and their subsequent effects on how, especially teenage girls, viewed their own bodies. I think it's probably pretty similar to that, just having more exposure to different information and the way in which, and social norms. Definitely, we have some evidence of that affects how people then view their own appearance.
Okay, and perhaps to take it a bit further, the internet addiction, the idea of internet addiction, or as I've seen it referred to, pathological internet use, seems to be something that a lot of people are concerned about. They're seeking to influence the amount of time that children spend on the internet and so on. What do you understand of this, and do you have a sense of how big the problem might be?
Sure. So from the most recent large survey that I know of, that was from 2014, in across different European countries, only 4.4% of teenagers were able to be categorized as having pathological internet use. So it's a very small proportion of the population of teenagers. I can send you that reference to make sure I'm getting that correct.
Sure.
And the internet addiction is, so the measurement of that is actually quite new, and I don't know if there's even been a scale that's been validated or refined. I remember a few years ago there were several different scales that people were using. They were modifying scales that had been developed for gambling to then measured dysfunctional internet use. And I think behavior, I mean, I don't know how much we can say that someone who shows pathological internet use is not just predisposed to have some sort of behavioral, a compulsive issue. So it might just be something that would have been present in this individual, perhaps with gambling, now has been shifted to this other possible means in which they are compulsively using, or to a dysfunctional level, the internet. But I know that the prevalence is much lower than might be perceived, because I think there's a general public perception that people are always online and in a way that's detrimental to their functionality. Maybe that people are always in some way connected or online or engaging online quite a bit, but we really need to measure how much that's impacting their relationships with the people around them, their ability to function at work or at school, and their health and well-being. And that's, yeah. Well,
okay, and in their functioning online and how that might be impacting their functioning in real life, multitasking, people, is often talked about as far as people's behavior, how it might be influenced. Have you looked at that, and what might we know about it?
Yeah, so multitasking, there have been a few studies looking based on a scale that was developed about media multitasking, and if that's related to different cognitive capacities or abilities for an individual. There was a really well cited and highly discussed paper that came out, I believe, in 2009, that found that college students with higher media multitasking were less likely to have the actual ability, were actually worse at multitasking. But then subsequently, there was a replication and extension of that paper, or of that study a few years later, that actually found the opposite effect. Found that individuals who self-report being heavy media multitaskers are actually better at task switching. So that's interesting to me, because it may even represent a cohort effect, the fact that they find something different between individuals measured in 2009 versus 2014. Who knows? But I think it's something to continue to follow up on. And it's the whole concept of multitasking being increased by digital technologies is really fascinating to me as a parent, because I feel like parents are just the supreme example of multitaskers. It is something parents just cannot avoid and are constantly doing. And yes, maybe parents are having a little bit of detriment in cognitive capacities at different points in time, maybe more related to sleep. I think that parents are doing just fine for the most part, and that we've been multitasking in a different way for, forever as humans, out of necessity. And maybe not, it's probably not any different in terms of its level or intensity with media multitasking. So that's my sense of it.
That makes sense. You can imagine sort of all sorts of scenarios historically where people would have been multitasking. That does seem quite normal. Okay, I got two other final questions. The first one is, you mentioned parenting. What advice would you give to parents who are concerned about the internet and their children? How should they approach that?
Yeah, so my number one advice is modeling. Children learn from their models around them. Children learn best from people that they find kind and that they like, and hopefully that's their parents too. When they're quite young, the way that we engage with technology, very young children pick up on. So if we're constantly looking at our phone and not engaging with our child, that's something that the child is going to pick up on. And I think just this awareness that we can have about how we as parents are using technology is the number one thing that we can do to protect and nurture the development of our child. And being aware of what purpose technology is serving the child, if it's serving as a means of expressing creativity or engaging in entertainment, is totally fine. Children it's not a crime for a child to be entertained by a cartoon or a movie or a game. This is not new. This is not a new way in which parents have interacted with children. It's just a different vehicle of engagement. Parents can also, again, not just with young children, but with teenagers, also be engaged with the technology use with the child, and that facilitates social bonding as well as being able to, watch your child learn and know what your child's doing as well. There will probably come a time, probably before your child hits puberty, that they will know how to do things with digital devices that they could teach you. I'm sure well before puberty this happens. And I guess more specific with the teenage years, to not take away your teenager's phone. Don't take away their means of connection with other people unless there is a detriment to their, functioning mental health that is related to that. But realizing that isn't just shielding them or promoting necessarily another means of engagement. It might actually be harming their ability to engage in real life as well with their friends. And it's one of the worst things you do is to socially isolate your teenager. Awareness around sleep also is maybe one of the most robust findings linking technology use to mental health with young people is when it infringes on sleep. It's not good. Teenagers need to get enough sleep, as do children, as do we all. And so an awareness around how technology use is impacting sleep is very important.
Yeah, very interesting that you're saying, it's about modeling behavior as parents, which of course is what we think of in other things that we do. There are lots of things that we're conscious of when we're with children that we watch our language and things like that. And it's similar to devices, but at the same time, I am aware of some parents who are, constantly on their devices and then telling their children not to do this. And clearly there is a disconnect there that is pretty obvious, right?
Right. Yeah, and really early on, there's some researchers here at the U of O who work on programs to help parents who might be struggling with caregiving connection and maybe coming from more stressful backgrounds. But they promote a very simple intervention called serve and return parenting, where train parents on noticing cues when children are trying to engage in a social interaction. And if a parent is just looking at their phone, they're missing so many important cues from their child that mark opportunities for engagement, which are crucial, especially in the early years, but continue to remain important throughout a child's life, that a parent is aware and available for that type of engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense to a layperson like me on this topic. But the last question I've got is for students themselves. Some of them are going to be watching this interview, and I thought I would finish with a question really just about advice you would have for them on their use of the internet.
Oh, sure. I think young people are the pioneers in understanding how new technologies, not just digital technologies, but how new technologies impact their functionality, or not necessarily functionality, but if they're really benefiting your life versus if it's become a burden. So for instance, people will get off of apps. Young people will be the first to get off of apps that no longer serve the purpose that they maybe originally served for them. So like connecting with other people. If an app or a platform such as Facebook stops being a place where really you can connect with your friends, and that becomes now Snapchat, then young people will migrate accordingly off of that device. So I feel like I wish young people had more agency and were able to be in more conversations around the uses and the benefits and the possible things that we should be worried about with digital technologies. And so if there's any way that your students could find ways to engage or even inform the developers of the structures that they engage with all the time. They're doing that already by giving free data, for having free access to certain tools and applications. But if there's a way to, I don't know, not discount their opinions about how they're using technologies and the way in which a society might better function in general through the use of technologies. That would be my general thought. And I think young people are quite aware of how how their use of technology is affecting them. I think they just, and also, and students who read articles about individuals in their age range and how technologies are affecting them, I think shouldn't necessarily take that as gospel, and to think about how they would actually conduct these studies and think about these technologies and think about the types of questions they would want to ask and what they would want to know and what's the evidence that they could possibly, what kind of studies could they perform or be involved in, or that could answer those questions, not necessarily the questions that adults and individuals who weren't raised around these technologies have about their impact.
Yeah, so their experience, their super experience of using the technologies is something that's valuable, and we should be seeking to learn as much as we can from.
Definitely, yeah. I work, whenever a high school student reaches out to me about a project around technology use, I say yes, because I would really like to know what a high school student wants to know about how technology is affecting their current peers.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, that was my last question. Thank you, Kate, for taking the time to do this. Your knowledge of the research and your consideration of it is, I think, very valuable, and I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. It's a lovely conversation to have, and I appreciate you reaching out to me about it.